Okay. Now, I felt after, reviewing a few of the emails I'm getting from students asking for help, and we're about to introduce yet a couple more methods for basically getting information up on the screen. So I was lying in bed last night, believe it or not, thinking about this and thought, you know what, I'm going to put a little PowerPoint. We've touched on a lot of these concepts separately, but I think I want to bring them all together into a single discussion, right? Well, I apologize. Right now with my PowerPoint up, I can't see the chat window. So if you're typing in the chat window, I won't know it at this stage in time. There, now I can kind of see it. Okay. So, just like having a big family gathering, you got to pass the data, pass the onions, please. Okay. So we're going to expand our menu of choices. Oh, see, it's a food and beverage application, right? So I have to get lots of food references in here. Our menu of choices for passing data to the view. So just think back when we first introduced how MVC works, right? We talked about this, the fact that, we have these three different roles, the model, the view, and the controller. A request comes in and it's the controller's job. He's like the conductor. He handles all the input, all the HTTP requests that come in. And then he will go off, he or she, I shouldn't genderize it, I guess, the controller will go off and work with the database most likely, or in some way come up with the data or model, right? That's going to be used to present the information back in response to what was requested, right? So the controller then takes the data and then works with the view, right? Remember, the view is a visual representation of the model, right? Or the data, okay? So it incorporates it in there in some way or fashion, and then the whole thing gets returned as the response to the user. So that's what I want to talk about is kind of that last step here, this as we take the data or the model and kind of insert it or work it into the view as we prepare it to go back, right? There's a few things to talk about in that. There are multiple ways of getting that data into the view, right? So we're just going to review a few of them to make sure there's a proper understanding because, I kind of went over it pretty quickly. It was touched on, okay, give me this at least. It was touched on in our textbook tutorial, but I want to explain it in my own words and hopefully break it down a little bit more for you, right? So how can we get data into the view? Well, first of all, the obvious thing is that directive that we often see at the very top of the page, the at model directive. Now that model could be a one of our classes, one of our model objects, right? Or it might even be a collection of them, okay? Right? So it might just be an instance or an entire collection. And of course, each object could be a composition containing its own objects and collections. That's where that dot include in our link really comes into play. So that, when we prepare an object to pass it off to the view, right, it can be a complex object with a composition containing a whole bunch of other things as well, right? Well, that's, our primary method of getting data into the view itself. But that's not all. No, we have Ginsu. No, we have other things as well. Oh, and just before we go on, I just want to note that not all views have to be strongly typed, right? In fact, in many cases, we'll make a view that isn't, right? If it's really just an informational thing and we don't really, need to actually pull a model object in any way, shape, or form to provide data for the view, right? For example, things like help files and so on probably would be a view that we would not have any strong typing, any model directive at the top. But that's the primary way, and we're all pretty familiar and comfortable with that concept at this point. But we've been using some others, so I want to clarify how they work to some degree, right? ViewData and ViewBag. You've seen both in the code that we've been using, right? And they were touched on in the tutorial, but they really accomplish the same thing. They pass information outside of the model because sometimes the model's great, right? That's the main way we get the data up and on the screen in front of the user. But sometimes there's extra things that we want to incorporate into the view, which are outside the model itself. And this is the primary way that we do this for the most part. Now, why are there two different things here, view data versus view bag, right? They both accomplish the same thing. What's the difference? Well, historically, we started off with view data, right? Later on, as C# became more powerful and capable, they wrapped ViewData in what they call the ViewBag. So let's talk about what they are. So ViewData is something familiar with, a dictionary, right? A key value dictionary, collection. But all the values require typecasting if it's a complex data type. So if it's even an array of strings, right? If we want to work with it as an array of strings, okay, that's no problem. We can add that object as an array of strings in our key value dictionary, right? The key will just be a simple string to identify, which member of the dictionary we're talking about. The value could contain an object of some sort. Let's stick with that example I just mentioned, a string array of other strings. Well, the trouble is, well, it's not really trouble, but the limitation is we need to be aware of is when we pull that out of this dictionary, the ViewData dictionary, we actually have to cast it as that string array, that array of strings, right? Before we can actually start working with it as what it is, an array of strings, right? So it's a simple dictionary. It doesn't do any typecasting. So as later on, I think it was version 4 of C# when that came out, the ability for dynamic objects came along. So somebody said, hey, you know what? We can make a dynamic wrapper around ViewData. And that gives us an awful lot of convenience because we can just go dot, make up a new property on the fly, right? Instead of being a key value pair, we just make up a name for a property of the ViewBag. Well, it's essentially the same thing as the key, right? And then we can assign any kind of an object we want. It can even be a complex object. And because of the dynamic nature of the view bag, when we go and we pull it out, so maybe it's going to ViewBag dot Fred, totally meaningless name, equals my string array, right? Then in the view, when I go ViewBag.Fred, it already knows that it is an array of strings. It's a string array. I don't have to typecast it in any way, shape, or form, right? So that's a great convenience and cleans up our code quite a bit, okay? It also does something, it'll handle null values without raising any errors, whereas the view data, if you actually got a null in there, it could cause problems, right? So does that help clarify? ViewBag is just this wrapper around ViewData, allowing us to basically dynamically create properties. Just go dot this, dot that, and make a new property. And it has the ability to remember what type of a object we stored in that property, right? So that's the main difference. Uh, but internally, it still actually is using ViewData. So bottom line, ViewBag is slower than ViewData, right? Because you're wrapping it in all this, superpowers, right? So basically, unless typecasting is required, right, unless it's a complex object you're storing in there and you're going to have to work with it, then by all means, just use ViewData, right, because it's faster, okay? However, if there's any typecasting involved, then that tiny difference in performance I would say is not worth it, which is why you'll usually see, even with something like our select list, right? You notice that we just use view data to put the select list into, okay, that dictionary. But when we pull it out with the view bag, right? And that saves us doing any typecasting at that point in time. All right. So that's the bottom line between ViewData and ViewBag. So hopefully that helped to clarify some of the confusion because really it's all the same thing. It's just a convenience for us to be able to wrap it in this dynamic object, which we call ViewBag, right? It's always good to have a view of our baggage at any point in time. But did you know there's a third one called Temp Data, right? It as well is a dictionary like ViewData. The main difference there, and we haven't used it yet, so I'm just giving you this now, so when we see it, you'll say, oh yeah, I do remember you talking about that, okay? Temp data is just another dictionary, but it has a longer lifespan, right? The truth is that, as we've seen, view data and of course ViewBag, because that's really just a wrapper around view data, they have a very short lifespan. We can put something into it in the controller, we send off the view to the client, and that's the end of story, right? It has no life beyond that point in time, right? Temp data, on the other hand, has a little bit longer, just a little bit longer lifespan. So it's mainly used to pass data from one action to another action, or even one controller to another controller, right? Basically, the data in there is persisted or saved, and then it gets automatically deleted after it's been recovered. In other words, once you access it, then it's gone. Let me give you an example of when we're going to use something like temp data. Think back to the structure that we have for a controller. Even think about the edit post, right? Inside the controller, right? We get data in there, we make some changes to it, we save it to the database, and what do we do after successfully accomplishing, like in the try of our try catches that we always add, whether it's create, delete, update, it doesn't matter, edit, I should say, right? In all of those, we use a try catch whenever we're going to talk to the database. Immediately after we successfully complete the operations inside try, what do we always do? For the most part, we usually redirect. Redirect back to the index action, and we show the index page. Well, what if there was some extra piece of information you did want to send a message to the user, right? Yeah, you're going to go back to the index. You're not going to redisplay the edit page just to say, hey, by the way, we successfully accomplished something, right? No, that would just confuse you. They think, oh, there must be a problem here. I wasn't able to save my changes on my edit page, right? No, we want to go back to the index, but wouldn't it be nice if we could stick a little extra message that might appear at the top of the page on the index, right? Well, that's a perfect situation where temp data works. We can't use view data because if I add it to view data right inside the edit action, well, it'll be gone. It won't live long enough, right? Once I redirect back to the index. But adding it into temp data will work. Okay, I can redirect to the index action, and that will be included in the data that's sent down to the index view. So right in the view, the index itself, I could use Razor syntax to access temp data, just like you've seen us do for things like ViewData, right? And then that value will be persisted long enough to actually show my message. Yay! I'm showing the message to the user right on that index page. So we haven't had a chance to put this into practice yet, but it's coming up soon. So it fit in with this discussion of the different ways of transferring data to the view, and in this case, from view to view, right? So that's why I figured it was a good time to talk about it now. Are we done? No, because we are next week going to be introducing something else. Dun, 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 dun. Partial views, right? So that's worth mentioning here because it's another way to carry data to the view. Now, that's not really the main purpose of a partial view, so let me explain a little bit, okay? We're about to start using them. Basically, think of any snippet of HTML that you might include in a view. If you want to, you can take that and put it into what we call a partial view. In a sense, almost all of our views are partial views in a certain way, right? Because we normally stick them inside that layout, right? But technically, layout is a partial view, right? So we're incorporating them together. Uh, what is the purpose of a partial view? It's like a snippet of the code that we normally write in any view. Well, it's mainly there, as it says, to reduce code duplication. If you find yourself creating the same markup over and over again, or even more typically, wanting to use the same little snippet of markup in multiple views, well, then that's a good case for creating a partial view, right? Because we can just render the partial view right in the middle of a different view. We just put a simple tag that says, go get this partial view, and it'll go and retrieve it and put it in place, right? So it really reduces code duplication. Also, it can be used, sometimes some of our views, the markup gets really, really long. We have a lot of information to show. So it's another way you could sometimes just break it up into components, right? Using partial views. So that's the main purpose for having partial views, but they can also carry additional data down there, okay? Because a partial view doesn't have to be, but it can also be strongly typed. It can have its own, that little at model directive, right? So we can provide its own data in its own model that is just part of the partial view. And then when we render the partial view inside of a larger view, right, it's carrying that additional data along with it. Okay. And you should be aware when we start using partial views that even though it's inserted, you might say, or rendered inside of a larger view, it has access to all of the view data of the parent view itself, right? So it can access all the same temp data, view data, ViewBag, you name it, right? The actual view it's being inserted into. So just think of it really that we're snipping a little bit of code that's reusable. Hey, I like this particular header, footer, filter section, whatever, right? All different types of things. I mean, we're going to be using this next week. In particular, we're going to add paging, right? So now, so far we've added sorting and filtering. So the next thing would be to actually page our data. So you have a large amount of data instead of scrolling up and down to see 1,000 records. We could page through like 10 at a time, 100 at a time, whatever. Right? So the little paging control, so we're going to stick on the bottom of every page, we're going to put that into a partial view, right? Okay. Oh, and just a final note there, a partial view itself can contain partial views, so it becomes a completely hierarchical arrangement, right? Okay, so I just want to run through this. We've talked about strongly typed views, ViewBag, ViewData, Temp Data, and now partial views. So that should help forearm you and prepare you for as we're starting to use more and more of these all different ways of just getting that data from, preparing it in the controller, pulling it from the database, whatever, putting it into a model or these other objects, and then getting it down to the user to be incorporated into the view itself. All right, thank you very much. Okay, so I'll stop and start recording.